Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we're going to unpack something truly fascinating. Ever wonder why we feel so fiercely, almost inexplicably loyal to a flag, a sports team, or a leader? Well, today we are dissecting the psychological and structural architecture of exactly why we join groups. We're looking at why we follow and how this deep-seated need to belong literally shapes our world. I mean, from the dawn of human history right up to the modern nation-state, these mechanisms of collective identity are just running constantly in the background. So get ready, because we are going to explore the very blueprint of human belonging.
Okay, let's dive into this. It's a highly provocative question, isn't it? What really separates a patriot from a cult member? Now, on the surface, these look like entirely different worlds. One is a widely celebrated civic virtue, and the other, well, it's a highly stigmatized form of social control. But if we strip away the emotion for a second and look strictly at the mechanics, they share a dangerously thin line. Both rely heavily on an us versus them binary. Both demand you sacrifice the self for the greater good. And both utilize foundational myths, sacred symbols, and this heavy underlying social threat of ostracization if you dare to deviate from group norms. The psychological machinery running both engines is shockingly similar.
But here's where things start to diverge. The absolutely critical difference lies in where the power flows and, honestly, how dissent is treated. You see, patriotism structurally allows for, and often completely relies on, internal critique. A patriot's devotion is to abstract ideals, things like liberty or justice. That means they can look right at their failing government and protest as an act of loyalty to those exact ideals. It self-corrects. Cultism, on the other hand, is a closed, self-referential loop that completely hijacks reality. Devotion is centralized to one specific leader. Criticism is totally forbidden, dissent is punished, and the exit barriers are incredibly high. Cultism uniquely demands the erasure of your personal ability to decide what's actually true.
Section 1. The Biology of Belonging. Why we follow.
To really understand collective identity, we have to look past this common idea that people are just lazy followers. Humans are obligate, gregarious organisms. That means, quite literally, our survival depends on sticking together. Our brains and survival strategies are fundamentally hardwired to function inside a group. And a critical analysis shows we are drawn into collectives across three distinct evolutionary tiers. First up is physical necessity. Look, for 99% of human history, an isolated individual was a dead individual. That biological echo is so strong today that when you feel socially excluded, your brain actually registers that pain using the exact same neural pathways as a physical injury. Second is cognitive economy, which we'll unpack in just a second. And third is psychological fulfillment. Collectives solve these deep existential anxieties for us. They provide identity, purpose, and honestly, an escape from the terrifying burden of total individual freedom.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept of cognitive economy is the sheer math behind it. The human brain makes up only about 2% of our total body weight, but it consumes 20% of our metabolic energy. Thinking is literally exhausting. So adopting a group's beliefs is this unconscious, highly efficient trade-off. Instead of calculating a massively complex moral or political framework from scratch, a collective just hands you a pre-packaged software suite of beliefs. It's not necessarily a moral failing at all. It's biological efficiency. But the danger? The danger is trading your intellectual sovereignty just for that comfort.
Section 2. Leaders versus followers. The cognitive cost. We really need to explore the profound difference between a healthy collaboration, where individuals actually choose to align, and the total abdication of critical thought. The philosopher Immanuel Kant anchors this perfectly. He explicitly blamed laziness and cowardice for why people remain uncritical followers. Think about how tempting that is in everyday life, right? When followership devolves into adopting a group's dogma wholesale, when we refuse to question contradictions or take moral responsibility, it becomes cognitive abdication. The follower essentially says, look, I will trade the burden of independent thought for the absolute comfort and certainty of the group.
But from a purely structural standpoint, we can't all be leaders. In game theory, leadership carries massive asymmetric costs. We're talking high energy requirements, immense risk, and is constant target-on-your-back accountability. Followership beautifully bypasses those costs and generates execution and alignment. Think about it. If a group of 100 people were all acting as leaders during a crisis, generating infinite variance and competing over every tiny little detail, they would splinter into 100 different factions and completely self-destruct due to coordination failure. Followership is mechanically necessary. It's uncritical followership that's the real danger.
Section 3.
Historical models of consensus, life without dictators. So, is there actually a way to build deep institutionalized collaboration without top-down, unquestioned hierarchies? Well, history provides brilliant proof that human communities can absolutely do this. Perhaps the most sophisticated historical example is the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy. Founded by the great peacemaker Hiawatha and the transformed sorcerer Tadodaho, they united 5 warring nations under the Great Law of Peace. Just imagine a bicameral longhouse where the older brothers and younger brothers exhaustively negotiate, facilitated by the firekeepers until absolute unanimity is reached among all 50 chiefs. There was no single autocrat who could just steamroll a decision. Every single voice had to be integrated.
We also see this in other decentralized historical networks. Take the Republic of Letters during the Enlightenment. This was a transnational community where authority wasn't inherited by a king, it was earned through empirical proof and rigorous peer debate across borders. Similarly, the Icelandic Commonwealth survived for centuries without a king or an executive branch. They relied purely on distributed authority, law speakers, and complex judicial courts where consensus and mutual compromise actively prevented blood feuds.
And this brilliantly illustrates how a healthy community actually operates. It isn't some linear, obedient pyramid. It operates as an iterative feedback network, a true cybernetic loop. An idea emerges, it undergoes distributed reflection from completely diverse viewpoints. It faces adversarial triage where it gets heavily critiqued and synthesized, and finally it reaches a consensus alignment. In this model, a leader isn't some oracle dictating reality to everyone. They're just a temporary facilitator crystallizing the group's own inherent brilliance.
Now, when analyzing peace and consensus, we really have to look at a cornerstone of modern voluntarist philosophy, the non-aggression principle, or the NAP. Popularized by thinkers like Larkin Rose, the NAP is the clear, foundational axiom that it is inherently immoral to initiate physical force or even the threat of force against a peaceful individual or their rightfully acquired property. Force is only ever justified in direct self-defense.
Let's compare this Western individualist philosophy with the indigenous framework we just discussed. They both desperately seek to minimize human bloodshed, but they approach it from completely opposite cultural directions. The NAP views peace as a negative state, meaning simply the absence of aggression. If we just leave each other alone, we have peace. It champions strict individual sovereignty and private property. The Great Law of Peace, however, views peace as this highly interdependent, active, spiritual practice. It requires continuous social justice, shared governance, and treating the earth as a collective stewardship for unborn generations.
Section 4. The weaponized state, when collectives turn toxic.
So, what exactly happens when that deep human instinct to belong is hijacked, when patriotism is stripped of its abstract ideals and warped into this uncritical collective mindset? The state very often manufactures a crisis, actively framing any dissent as a betrayal of the homeland. Historically, this is exactly when the state violates both the consensus of the Great Law of Peace and the individuality of the NAP. In 1779, fueled by nascent patriotism, the Sullivan Expedition totally bypassed diplomacy to brutally destroy Haudenosaunee settlements. Jump to 1942, and under the guise of national defense, the state violated the property and liberty of completely peaceful Japanese Canadians and Americans by forcing them into internment camps. And then, from the 1950s right through the 70s, the FBI's COINTELPRO initiated covert aggression against peaceful domestic civil rights and anti-war groups, all in the name of protecting the nation from subversion.
The core mechanism driving this toxicity is pretty simple. The state essentially utilizes patriotic fervor to hide raw aggression under the banner of national security. When citizens just blindly accept covert or overt violence against peaceful individuals simply because their group or their leader commanded it, they have completely erased their own epistemological autonomy. That's their fundamental ability to know what is real and true for themselves. At that exact flashpoint, patriotism has mutated completely into a cult of personality.
Section 5. Guarding your sovereign mind. Blueprints for autonomy.
Okay, so how do we actually protect ourselves here? First up, we need structural guardrails. Cult-like patriotism absolutely requires a highly centralized state. By emulating the local autonomy of the Haudenosaunee or the Icelandic Commonwealth, we can push power downward. Radical decentralization means local communities retain true veto power, which legally starves a centralized leader's capacity to mobilize the entire population for offensive violence. Paired with a strict legal separation that restricts forces to purely defensive actions, the whole machinery of state-sponsored violence suddenly loses its teeth. So the absolutely crucial point here is that structural changes just aren't enough on their own. We need cognitive guardrails as well. We must practice the mental model of inversion, actively trying to prove our own national narratives and group beliefs wrong. If a belief cannot withstand fierce logical critique, well, it's a dogma, not a value. We must consciously decouple our love for our culture, our land, and our neighbors from blind loyalty to the political regime running the government. Internal critique isn't treason, folks. It is a vital, absolute health check.
Which really leaves us with one massive, essential question to ask ourselves today. Are you participating in true, independent collaboration, or have you outsourced your conscience to a flag? The ultimate defense against toxic collectivism is an unwavering commitment to your own moral accountability. Because peace, sanity, and freedom can only ever survive when individuals refuse to let a group do their thinking for them. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning everything.